I was sitting inside a courthouse, not as a witness, not as a spectator, but as the woman who had just watched the judge sign the paperwork that transferred every single asset I had spent 22 years building into the hands of my stepson. $6 million gone. My real estate portfolio, my commercial properties, my retirement accounts, my name was removed from my own company. And you know what the most terrifying part of all of this is? I handed him the keys myself. Not because I was naive, not because I was careless, but because I loved him like a son. And while I was loving him, he was plotting against me. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end the way you think it does. Before I go any further, if this story already has your jaw on the floor, please hit that subscribe button right now and smash that like button so more people can see this story, because honestly, the world needs to know this can happen to anyone. And I want to ask you something directly. If someone you trusted, someone you raised, someone you loved like family betrayed you to steal everything you built, what would you do? Tell me in the comments below, because every single one of your responses matters to me. Okay, let's get into this. Let me start from the very beginning. My name is Diana Mercer, and I'm 50 years old. I know what you're probably picturing right now. A woman in her 50s, maybe sitting somewhere comfortable, telling a story. Maybe a little weathered, maybe a little tired. And honestly, you wouldn't be wrong, because the story I'm about to tell you aged me in ways I cannot fully explain. But I want you to know something before I start. I am not a victim. I refuse to be a victim. I was a fighter before this happened, and I am a fighter now, perhaps even more so. What I went through would have broken a lot of people. It tried very hard to break me. What I'm going to tell you today is the truth, every bit of it. The rise, the trust, the betrayal, the destruction, and the resurrection. Because there was a resurrection. You'll get there with me. Just stay. I grew up in a small town outside of Beaumont, Texas. My father was a plumber, and my mother worked at a bank as a teller for 31 years. We weren't rich, we weren't poor, we were steady. And from the time I was about 9 years old, I was obsessed with two things: houses and numbers. I'd flip through real estate listings in the newspaper like other kids flip through comic books. I'd look at a house and think, what does this cost to run? What does it cost to fix? What is someone willing to pay to live here? Even as a little girl, my brain worked that way. My dad used to laugh and say, "Diana, you're going to be a tycoon someday." I studied business at the University of Houston on a partial scholarship, worked nights at a diner to cover the rest, graduated with honors in 1996, and within 2 years I had my real estate license, a modest savings account, and an enormous amount of ambition. I flipped my first house at 24, made $11,000 profit. To some people, that's nothing. To me, standing in my tiny apartment with that check in my hand, it felt like $1 million. It felt like proof that the way I saw the world, the way I saw opportunity, was real. By the time I was 30, I had a small portfolio of rental properties. By 35, I had moved into commercial real estate and was managing a team of 8 people. My business, Mercer Properties LLC, was growing every single year without fail. And somewhere in the middle of all of that growth, I fell in love. His name was Robert Callahan. He was charming, funny, a contractor who'd done some renovation work on one of my properties. We dated for 2 years, and when he proposed, I said yes. I was 37, and he had a 12-year-old son named Colton from his first marriage. I want to be very clear about something. I never had children of my own, not because I didn't want them, but because life moved fast and the timing never lined up the way I'd hoped. So when I stepped into Colton's life, I gave him everything I had. I wanted to be the woman in his life that showed up consistently, lovingly, completely. I taught him to drive. I went to his baseball games. I helped him study for his SATs. I was there when his grades slipped in 10th grade, sat at the kitchen table with him for 3 weeks straight until they came back up. When Robert and I had rough patches in the marriage, which we did, because every marriage does, I never once let Colton feel that tension. I protected him from it. And he called me Mom. Not every day, but sometimes when things were quiet and good between us, he would look at me and say it. And every single time, it meant everything to me. Robert and I divorced when Colton was 19. It wasn't dramatic. There was no cheating, no blow-up. We had simply grown apart in the ways that sometimes happen between two very busy, very different people. We parted respectfully, and when we sat down with Colton to tell him, I looked at my stepson and I said, "This changes nothing between you and me. I am still here. I will always be here." And I meant it, with everything in me. Colton was 20 when he asked if he could come work for me. He'd taken some college classes, wasn't sure about his direction. He said he wanted to learn the business. I was proud, genuinely proud. I sat him down, gave him a tour of how things worked at Mercer Properties, explained the portfolio, the systems, the financials, all of it. I hired him as an administrative assistant at first, paying him a fair market salary, no nepotism, no special treatment. Over the next several years, he proved himself. He was smart, really smart. He had a good eye for property valuations. He was charming with clients, excellent on the phone. By the time he was 25, I had made him vice president of operations, and I was paying him $140,000 a year. That's when things started to quietly change, and I was too busy, too trusting to see it. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the seeds were planted, but at the time, every red flag felt like something explainable, something reasonable. Because when you love someone, your brain works very hard to protect that love. It reframes things. It smooths the edges. The first thing I noticed and dismissed was that Colton started asking about the company structure, not in a curious, learning things way, in a very specific, very pointed way. He wanted to understand exactly who could sign what, who held the authority to authorize transfers, who held power of attorney. I told myself he was being thorough, that he was growing into his executive role and wanted to understand governance. I actually felt proud of him for asking. The second thing was that he started spending a lot of time with our company attorney, Marcus Webb. At first, I thought it was about a contract dispute with one of our property managers, but the meetings started happening without me being informed. I'd find out afterward, casually, that Colton and Marcus had touched base about something. When I asked Colton directly, he smiled that easy smile of his and said, "I'm just learning the legal side of things, Mom. You've always told me I should understand the whole picture." He used my own words against me, and I nodded and said, "You're right. I'm glad." The third thing was a woman named Stacy Renner. She joins our company as our new CFO 18 months before everything collapsed. Colton had recommended her highly, said they had gone to school together, that she was brilliant with numbers. I interviewed her, liked her, and hired her. What I did not know, what I would not find out until it was almost too late, was that Stacy was Colton's girlfriend. He had deliberately withheld that information. And together, over the course of 14 months, the two of them had been systematically restructuring the financial accounts of my company. Small changes at first, vendor payments routed through a new shell LLC they had quietly formed, named, almost mockingly, Callahan Asset Holdings. Callahan, his father's last name, not mine. He never took my name. I understood that. But standing in my attorney's office 18 months later, looking at those documents, that detail cut me in a place I didn't expect. They moved slowly, patiently. They changed beneficiary information on 3 of my commercial accounts over a 12-month period, each change separated in time that none of my bank alerts were triggered. They submitted amended operating agreements to the state of Texas with subtle language changes that would, once fully executed, give Colton the authority to dissolve and reconstitute Mercer Properties LLC as a new entity I was not part of. And here is the detail that still makes me physically sick to think about. They had been coaching Marcus, our attorney, my attorney, a man I had known for 11 years. They had been feeding him information and money to look the other way, and in at least 2 instances, to actively facilitate their transactions. The entire machine had been running for over a year before I saw the first crack. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I was reviewing the monthly financial summary, something I did personally every month. I always had, and I noticed a recurring payment to a vendor I didn't recognize, $22,000 a month going to a company called RCX Facility Solutions. I called our office manager to ask who approved this vendor relationship. There was a long pause on the phone. Then she said quietly, "Colton set that up about 8 months ago. I assumed you knew." I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time. I want to tell you exactly what the moment of full betrayal felt like. Not the pieces of it, not the discovery. The moment where I looked at my stepson's face and I knew completely, undeniably what he had done. After discovering the RCX payment, I said nothing to Colton for 4 days. I hired an independent forensic accountant on the advice of a friend, a woman named Jan who had been through a corporate fraud situation at her own company years ago. Jan drove from Austin to sit with me at my kitchen table and said, "Diana, say nothing, change nothing. Let me look at everything first." What her team found over the next 6 weeks was almost incomprehensible in its scale and detail. This hadn't been impulsive. This had been a 3-year plan. They found evidence of early research going back to the very month Stacy was hired. Colton had been planning this before Stacy arrived. She was recruited specifically to execute the financial components he couldn't navigate alone. The total value of assets they had maneuvered into position to transfer, $6.2 million. 11 properties, 4 business accounts, 2 retirement trusts that had been restructured using forged signatures, my signatures, forged. On a Friday morning in December, I called Colton into my office. I asked him to close the door. He sat down across from me, relaxed, easy, the way he always was, that casual confidence he'd had since he was a teenager. And I slid a single piece of paper across the desk to him. It was a summary document from my forensic accountant, just the top page, just enough for him to know that I knew. I watched his face. I need you to understand. I watched his face. And for exactly 3 seconds, I saw something I had never seen there before. Pure, raw, cold calculation. No surprise, no confusion, no panic. Just the look of someone recalibrating. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mom, Let's talk about this calmly. Mom. He called me Mom. I said, don't. Just that one word. And something in my voice, something I had never let him hear before, stopped him completely. I told him he had until Monday to retain his own legal counsel. I told him I had already contacted the Texas State Bar about Marcus Webb. I told him that a criminal referral had been filed with the Harris County District Attorney's Office that morning. And I told him, and this is the part I will never regret, not for 1 second, I told him, I loved you. I loved you completely and without condition, and you need to live with what you did with that. Then I stood up, walked out of my own office, and drove to my sister's house. And I sat in her kitchen and I shook for about an hour straight while she held my hand and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. The empire I had spent 22 years building had been hollowed out from the inside by the boy I had called my son. I'm going to be honest with you about what came next, because I think too many of these stories skip the part where the person just falls apart. And I did. I fell apart. Not publicly, not in a way most people could see. I still got up every morning, I still returned calls, I still showed up. But inside there was a grief I did not have language for. It wasn't just the money. God, I want you to understand that. It was never just the money. It was the 13 years I had given to that boy. The baseball games and the SAT prep and the driving lessons and the birthday cakes and the late-night conversations when he was in college and struggling and called me because he told me once, because I always knew what to say. All of that had been sitting next to something else in his heart, something calculating and cold, and I couldn't reconcile those two things. I stopped sleeping normally for about 6 weeks. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with this wave of nausea, not from physical illness, but from the replaying of moments. Every memory I had of Colton ran through a new filter. Every kind thing, every I love you, Mom, every moment of closeness, I turned it over looking for the lie. And that is its own kind of torture. Questioning your own memories. I went to therapy. I'm not ashamed to say that. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Rachel Osei, who was one of the finest human beings I have ever encountered, said something to me in our 3rd session that I still think about. She said, Diana, the love you gave was real. The betrayal was real. Both things are true. You don't have to choose which one to believe. That sentence saved me. Not immediately, but it planted something. My ex-husband, Robert, called me when word got out about what Colton had done. He was devastated in his own way, ashamed, actually. He offered to testify on my behalf. He said, whatever you need, Diana, whatever you need. And I appreciated that more than I could express. But I didn't need Robert to rescue me. I needed to rescue myself. The breakdown, if I'm being completely honest, lasted about 4 months. 4 months of functioning on the outside and grieving on the inside. 4 months of letting my legal team do their work while I tried to stay upright. 4 months of my sister calling every single day just to check in. 4 months of learning that the people who really love you, who have always really loved you, will still be there when the floor falls out. And then, one morning, I woke up and something had shifted. I can't explain it perfectly, but I got up, made coffee, and thought, I built it once, I will build it again. And this time, nobody's taking it. Now here is where this story takes a turn that I genuinely did not see coming, and I was the one living it. While my legal team was building the civil case and the DA's office was pursuing the criminal charges, my forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Patricia, discovered something buried in the shell company documents that nobody had looked at closely enough. Callahan Asset Holdings, the company Colton and Stacy had used to funnel my money, had a third partner, a silent investor, whose name appeared only once in an obscure addendum attached to the original operating agreement for the shell company. The name was Henry Mercer, my brother. I want to let that land for a moment before I continue. My brother, Henry, who I had lent $80,000 to in 2019 when his own business failed. My brother, Henry, who had attended Christmas dinner at my house every year for the past decade. My brother, Henry, who had held my hand at my mother's funeral 2 years prior. My brother Henry had invested $200,000 of seed capital into Callahan Asset Holdings, the vehicle being used to steal from me. He had done it 18 months before the scheme began. He knew. He had been part of the original plan. Patricia placed the documents in front of me in her conference room, and she didn't say anything for a long time. She just let me read. And I read the same page 3 times because my brain kept refusing to process it. When I finally looked up, my face must have been something to see, because Patricia quietly slid a box of tissues across the table and said, "Take whatever time you need." I knew something was wrong. I had been fighting something I understood, but this rewrote everything again. The gravity of the betrayal doubled in an instant. It wasn't just my stepson, it was my blood. I didn't call Henry. I didn't confront him. I called my attorney and I said, "Add him." That's all. Add him. The criminal investigation, once it widened to include Henry, uncovered something that answered a question I had been asking for years and never knew I was asking. When my parents passed, my mother in 2022, my father in 2018, their estate was modest: a house, some savings, a small life insurance policy. Henry and I were co-beneficiaries. The estate attorney had handled the dispersal, and I had received my half without question. Henry had handled most of the paperwork because I was deep in a major commercial acquisition at the time, and I trusted him. The investigators found that Henry had rerouted a significant portion of my parents' life insurance payout. Nearly $340,000 of what should have come to me had been diverted through a set of transactions that were structured to look like estate fees and legal costs. He had been stealing from me even then. And I believe, though the investigators were careful with their language about this, that Colton knew. Colton had been present during Henry's communications about the estate. At some point, possibly years ago, Henry had recruited Colton into a longer, more elaborate scheme. My stepson hadn't invented this betrayal on his own. He had been brought into it by a man who shared my last name. My brother had used my stepson as his instrument, and my stepson, hungry enough, ambitious enough, unscrupulous enough, had been willing. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from learning that the wound you thought you understood is actually much deeper than you knew. I had to go to therapy more frequently after that. I had to sit with the knowledge that the theft of my parents' legacy had happened while I was eulogizing my father, while I was grieving. But here is what I also know. The truth, even when it's brutal, is better than living a comfortable lie. I would rather know this, all of it, than go another decade loving people who had never stopped treating me like a resource to be extracted. The secret was out, every layer of it, and now we had all of it on record. The civil trial began on a Monday morning in September. I wore a charcoal gray suit. My attorney, a woman named Beverly Torres, who was frankly the sharpest legal mind I have ever encountered, wore red. I thought that was a good omen. Colton arrived with his attorney, looking calm and composed. He caught my eye briefly when he entered the courtroom, and I held his gaze steady, unflinching. I needed him to know that the woman sitting at that plaintiff's table was not the woman he had taken advantage of. That woman was still present, but so was someone else, someone who had been in that forensic accountant's office and decided to fight. Henry sat at a separate defense table. He looked older than I remembered. He didn't look at me at all. Beverly's opening argument was surgical. She laid out the 3-year timeline with documentary precision. She showed the forged signatures side by side with authenticated samples of my actual signature. She walked through the shell company structure, the vendor payment scheme, the beneficiary changes, every piece of it clear and methodical and damning. Colton's attorney tried to argue that Colton had acted within the scope of his executive authority and that I had granted him that authority. Beverly demolished this in cross-examination by producing internal communications, texts and emails, in which Colton had explicitly discussed concealing his activities from me. There was a message to Stacy in which he wrote, "She trusts me completely. That's the whole play." When Beverly read that message aloud in the courtroom, I heard someone behind me audibly inhale. I did not look away from the documents on the table in front of me. I did not cry. I had done my crying. Now I was here to win. Stacy Renner had agreed to a plea deal with the DA's office in exchange for full cooperation. She testified for the prosecution for 2 full days. She was thorough, specific, and, I believe, genuinely remorseful. She did not minimize her own role, which I respected, even as I sat there listening to the details of how she had forged my name. On the 4th day of trial, the criminal case was presented concurrently through coordinated filings. Colton and Henry both faced wire fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy charges. Marcus Webb, the attorney who had facilitated some of the transactions, had already lost his law license and had entered his own guilty plea 6 weeks prior. He sat in the gallery during parts of the civil trial, looking like a man already serving his sentence. The most difficult moment of the entire proceedings was when Colton took the stand in his own defense. He was composed, articulate, and completely believable. And I say that not to give him a compliment, but to explain why he had been able to do what he did for as long as he did. He could look a room full of people in the eye and sound perfectly reasonable. His attorney walked him through a narrative about feeling overlooked, underappreciated, about believing that the company would eventually have gone to him anyway, since I had no other heirs. He framed himself as a man who had simply tried to secure a future he felt was rightfully his. Beverly stood up her cross and asked him exactly one question. "Mr. Callahan, on March 14th of last year, did you send a text message to Stacy Renner reading, quote, 'She trusts me completely, that's the whole play'?" He said yes. No further questions. She sat down, and the room was very quiet. The civil judgment came back in my favor in its entirety. Full restitution of $6.2 million in diverted assets, plus $1.1 million in punitive damages. Every property, every account, every asset was ordered returned or compensated. The shell company was dissolved by court order. In the criminal case, Colton was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. With good behavior, he could be out in 4 to 5 years. Henry received 5 years and was ordered to pay full restitution for the estate theft going back to my parents' funds, plus interest. Stacy Renner, for her cooperation, received a suspended sentence and 3 years of probation. She also lost her CFO license. Whether that's enough justice for her role, I leave to people to form their own opinions. Marcus Webb was disbarred and received 18 months in federal minimum security. The State Bar of Texas made an example of him, which I'm told was intentional. On the day the verdict was read, I sat in that courtroom and I felt something I want to describe as accurately as I can. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even relief exactly. It was something quieter, closer to completion, like a door being closed firmly with the lock clicking into place. Beverly and I walked out of that courthouse into afternoon sun, and she squeezed my hand and said, "You did that." I said, "We did." She shook her head. "No, Diana, you did the hard part. I just carried the documents." My sister was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She didn't say anything. She just held her arms open, and I walked into them, and I let myself feel all of it for exactly 60 seconds before I straightened up, took a breath, and looked at what came next. It has been 14 months since the verdict. I want to tell you where I am now. Mercer Properties LLC is operational, not at the level it was. Some of the relationships, some of the momentum, some of the institutional trust I'd built over 2 decades took real damage during the legal proceedings and the period of uncertainty. You can win in court and still feel the aftermath in your business. That's the truth nobody tells you. But the company is growing again, slowly, methodically, the right way. I have a new CFO, a woman named Carolyn who came with sterling references and who I vetted within an inch of her life before signing her offer letter. I have new attorney. I have new structures and protocols and safeguards that I had never felt the need to implement before because I had trusted the people around me. I implement them now without apology. I do not have a relationship with Colton. I do not expect to have one. I've thought about what that means, whether I grieve it, whether I leave the door open in some corner of my heart. I've been honest with myself about it. What I feel is something I would describe as a permanent, tender sorrow. Not hatred, not rage, just the quiet sadness of something that was real to me and that I now understand was a fiction for him. That sorrow, I think, will always be there. I've made peace with carrying it. I do not have a relationship with Henry either. My attorney sent him a letter informing me that I considered our familial relationship to be concluded. He responded through his attorney, asking if we might someday reconcile. I did not reply. What I do have, what I want to end this story on, is gratitude. I know that sounds strange, but I am grateful for what I know now. Grateful for Jan, who told me to stay silent and call a forensic accountant. Grateful for Beverly, who is brilliant and fierce and believed in this case from the first meeting. Grateful for Patricia, who found every single hidden document. Grateful for Dr. Osei, who helped me put myself back together without letting me hate myself for having loved wrong. Grateful for my sister, who called every single day. And I am grateful, genuinely, surprisingly grateful, for the version of myself that came out the other side of this, because she is harder where she needed to be harder, and softer where it actually matters, and wiser in ways that no business school could have ever taught me. At 50 years old, I have been stripped down to the foundation and I have rebuilt, not as the woman I was, as the woman I am now. And that woman, that version of Diana Mercer, is not someone anyone will outmaneuver again. I built the empire once, I built it twice, and this time I hold every key. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly. You sat with me through it all. If this story moved you, if it made you think about trust and family and what we owe the people who raise us, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if something like this has ever touched your own life, whether it's a family betrayal or a business theft or just someone you loved using that love against you, I want to hear from you. Leave me a comment. Let's talk about it.